Welcome back, everyone. Just a quick couple of questions before we proceed. So Renee says, in my previous question, I was referring to, for example, Java plugin is not same as the Java software because you showed us a place to install Java on Jenkins as opposed to using the plugin that's there already. Very good question, Renee. So there are a couple of ways to install a plugin onto a server. Now we'd obviously look at that more into the detail in a while, but to answer your question, there are two ways to actually work with any software with Jenkins. So in this case, I already have Java installed on my server. So when I create a job that requires Java to be executed, I have two options. First option is that I can use the Java of the operating system that we had installed earlier, or I can install Java from that Jenkins page and make Jenkins use that particular Java plugin. To give you another example, we're going to be working with a Java application. We'll start working with a Java application in a short while. So to build a Java application, there is a tool called Maven. So there are two ways I can work with Maven. Either I can run apt-get install Maven and install it in the operating system and make my job use that plugin or that software, or I can install Maven within Jenkins and make Jenkins use that software. So there are two ways of using things. We'll see how and why in a while, but there are these two ways, and you can use either of those when you're working with Jenkins. Cool. Another question is from Rakesh. Rakesh says, so for a CICD pipeline, we are choosing Jenkins working as an assistant because it will take care of Docker and Kubernetes and work together. Yes, Rakesh. So again, it's not just limited to Docker and Kubernetes. In this the example we'll start with, we're going to be working with like a very basic Java application. So Java works with a tool called Maven, and Maven is the tool that can build any Java code. Maven is a tool that can test any Java code. Maven is the tool that can compile any Java code. So basically, Jenkins will work with Maven to build and test and package the Java application that we have. Now, in case his follow-up question is, if a .NET application, how can we do this? So Ramesh, you'll have to find, I think there is something, I really forgot the name of it. There is something called as .NET service or something in Jenkins. Now, obviously, this is the question that has to be answered by the development team. The very basic question you should be asking yourself is how would you test an application manually? Once you are able to test an application manually, is when you go to Jenkins and you start automating things. If you don't know how to do something manually, then there is no way you can automate it using Jenkins. Sandeep says, yeah. So the question was about .NET, and Aditya says maybe it is MS Build plugin. Exactly, yes. Thank you very much, Aditya. I'd forgotten the name of it, but the plugin that you would use is called MS Build, Microsoft Build. So there is a plugin called MS Build that can work with .NET applications in general for Jenkins. So again, this is where you would need to interact with the application development team and figure out how they're doing it manually. Understand the difference. Your job is to automate things. Your job at an entry level DevOps point is not to solve the problems. Your job is to automate the repetitive tasks. That's where Jenkins comes into the picture. But if you don't know how you would test or build a .NET application manually, forget about Jenkins. You have to understand how you would do it manually first, and then you start thinking about Jenkins and how you would automate things using Jenkins. That's how it'll work. Now, Sandeep says, is there anything for WordPress or website that is developed in PHP? Sandeep, I think you are the one who also asked me another question about WordPress the other day. Now, to start, to actually answer the question right, WordPress itself, it's not really a microservice application. WordPress simply has PHP MySQL and probably a DNS to route your domain name. So in case of PHP MySQL, now PHP does not need to be compiled. There is a difference between PHP and Java. There is a difference between C Sharp and PHP. Okay, give me one moment. So there is Java, there is C, there is C Sharp, there is C++, there is .NET. All of these language are compiled language, meaning there has to be some sort of compiler running in the background to actually compile the application. But the languages like PHP, Python, I'm sorry, I can't really type, but PHP, Python, Ruby, Perl, what happened? Ruby, Perl, Golang, these languages don't really need any kind of compilation. They are interpreted, meaning you can directly just run the code. That doesn't, you don't really need to compile anything from the code. So it really depends on the language that you're working with. Now, the principle still stands in the exact same logic. You first have to understand how would you your question is how would I automate the deployment of a WordPress? Now, my question is, do you understand how would you install it manually? I know for a fact how WordPress works because my own website is designed on WordPress. But the point is, the moment you understand how WordPress works manually is when you can package the entire application in Docker and then automate the entire build process. Now, that is something we can talk about maybe a week later once we have done quite a few things with Docker and Jenkins and all of that. But I'll hold on to that question for now. Cool. We'll continue at this point. Let me get rid of all the drawings that I have. Right. So Sandeep says, I know all about WordPress installation, but I want to build it using Jenkins and Docker. Yes, Sandeep. So again, I will hold on to the question until we get to the Docker part. Again, Jenkins is not a build tool. Jenkins is not a package tool. Jenkins is a tool that will work with the tool that can package the application for you. So in your example, if you're using Docker to package your WordPress application, you obviously need to understand Docker first. Then Jenkins comes into the picture. But right now we're dealing with Jenkins. So we'll hold on to that question for a while until we actually get to the Docker part. Ramesh says, can we know the difference while doing, jobs with Java and .NET in Jenkins? I'm really sorry, Ramesh. I don't really think I understand the question as much as I'd like to. Uh, so I said when you're working with Java, there's a tool called Maven. Now, anyone with a Java background would know what Maven is. So there is a tool called Maven that can build and compile and package a Java application. So first you need to figure out how would you package, compile, and build a .NET application, and then find out a plugin in Jenkins and basically, do the same things. Now hold on to the build pipeline, the CI/CD questions for a while, because there are a few things that you need to understand about Jenkins first before we actually move on to the pipeline part. Cool. So we'll continue from where we left off. Just give me one moment here. Where is my Jenkins? Okay, here's my Jenkins. All right, so let's go back to my job. Now, obviously, this is a very simple job that we've created, but this time I'll go to configure, and what we want to look is we want to look at the build triggers. So we talked about a build trigger yesterday where I said a job would be triggered dependent on some action. Now that action can be done remotely, that action can be time-based, that action can be anything. So the first option that I have here that at least we are interested in is called build periodically. Now if I click on build periodically, it asks me when do I want this job to be run. To give you an example, let's say you're upgrading the operating system of all of your servers every Saturday night midnight. So there are some commands that have to be run every Saturday night midnight. So if I scroll down, this is where you would actually type the command. But let's say if this was the command that I wanted to run, this is where you can set up the timeline. Now, this timeline, you cannot simply say run Saturday midnight. You can't really say that. This timeline format has to be a cron job format. Now, the people that have worked with Linux before, they understand what cron job is. Now, people that are coming from Windows background, you have something called as, I think it's called scheduled tasks or scheduled jobs, something like that. So you have something called as, one second. Let's just make sure we know what it's called. Should, I'm sorry, I can't type Windows. Yeah, so it's called scheduled tasks in Windows. Now, scheduled task is similar to cron jobs in Linux. Now, in this case, if I'm saying I want this job to run at certain point in time, I have to provide a proper cron job format. Now, even if you're working with Linux, if you have some experience with Linux, it may be a little difficult to, just simply type something in cron format. So I use this website called crontab.guru, which basically gives you, if you wanted to like create a cron job for a certain point, you can basically edit this and it will give you the format. Now for the people that have never worked with cron jobs, this is what the format looks like. So the first option is the minute, second option is the hour, third option is the day of the month, fourth option is the month of the year, and the fifth option is the day of the week. Now, let's say I want this job to run every 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes, no matter what day, what year, what month, whichever month it is, I want this cron job to run every 2 minutes. So in that case, I can simply say, so basically this says run this job every 2 minutes. Now, obviously you need some experience with, this format, but if you don't have one, you can, come here and learn about it. Now this is what I've said here. Now you see the moment I say star slash two star 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 star, it basically says at every second minute. That's what I'm doing here. I'm saying run my job every second minute, no matter what day it is, no matter what week it is, no matter what month it is, and no matter what day of the week it is. So basically every 2 minutes, and I'll save this. Now we'll give it a couple of minutes. Right now, I have 5 builds that I've run for now. So if I give it a couple of minutes, I'm hoping that the sixth build will be triggered automatically. So we'll give it a couple of minutes and we'll see what happens. While we are waiting for it, Aditya says, I think I'll need the job to be run whenever developer commits a change to the repository. How can I trigger, that thing? Aditya, I'll hold on to that for a moment. We'll get to that. Right now, we are still talking about triggers based on time. We'll look at the repos in a while. Cool. So we'll give it a couple of minutes. I'll also like there is a link here. I'm not sure if you can read this, but it says enable auto refresh. It would also be there in your Jenkins. So if I click on it, Jenkins will like automatically refresh the page every 10 seconds. So we might, yeah. So if you notice, the sixth build was just run. So I'd not triggered it manually. This was done automatically. Now if I look at the logs, can anybody spot a difference here? Like if Okay, let me open up the fifth job here and the sixth job here. Now, here's the log of the fifth job, and here's the log of the sixth job. Can anybody notice the difference between both the logs? Let's see if you can actually. Exactly. So I have a lot of people answering the same question. Uh, so each one of you is right. The only difference is in this case, it says started by timer, and when I triggered the job manually, it said started by user so and so. So if you're manually clicking on build now of a job, it would record, or it would keep a record that this job was executed by so and so user at so and so time. But if it's an automatic trigger, like the job is triggered automatically, in that case it will say started by timer, because I did not click on build now myself. It was triggered automatically. So in this case the same job was run. The only difference is it was started automatically by the timer. Now if I go back to my job, this was run like 1 minute and 38 seconds ago. So while configuring the job, I've said I want this job to run every 2 minutes. So I'm expecting this like one more build in 10 seconds, right? So if I refresh this page, 155, so in 5 seconds, I'm expecting one more build to run. If I refresh, you see now I have a seventh build. So I hope this clarifies the idea of triggers based on time. Now the only thing you need to learn is how to write this cron tab format if you've never worked with cron tab in Linux. As long as you can write these formats, you can go back and you can configure the job and basically trigger it based on time. Now, if I go back to my job and if I click on configure, right now we have this job configured to be like to run or to be executed every 2 minutes. Now, I have another option here which says poll SCM. Now, if I click on poll SCM, this is where I can hook up a GitHub repo to this particular job. Now, let me just type it and I'll tell you what exactly do I need. So in this case, instead of build periodically, I'm saying poll SCM. Now the only difference is when I say poll SCM, it would actually be hooked up to a Git repo. Now, since I'm saying this, it's an SCM. SCM stands for source code management. Now Git is a source code management software. So in this case, I would have to select Git. I'll have to give it a URL of the repo assuming the repo is public, or you would also have to like add the authentication if the repo is private. Now if I was to get the repo of, let's just say, this repo, if I clone this repo, I'll have to paste the link of the repo and then I'll define the schedule. Now I'm also saying run this every 2 minutes, but there is a difference here. When I say poll SCM and run it every 2 minutes, the difference is the actual job will not run every 2 minutes. The job will actually check with the github.com to see if there is any difference inside the repo. So when I say 2 minutes, I'm saying check with my Git repo every 2 minutes and run the job only if there is a difference in the repo than the last time you executed the job. So it will check with my Git repo every 2 minutes. If there are no changes to the repo, if there are no new commits inside the repo, it will not actually run the job. It will only check the repo every 2 minutes. I hope I'm clear enough about this. So there are two ways we can trigger a job. First is the time-based trigger, where I can say run this job and so time. And if I say time-based, in that case, it would not really matter if there is a change in the repo or not. It would always run the job. But when I say poll SCM, in this case, I'm basically saying check the repo every 2 minutes and run the job if there is any change inside the repo itself. So we'll save this and we'll see what happens. While we're waiting for like 2 minutes for this, you would notice that like this ran at 3:44. Sorry, this ran at 4:26, 4:28, 4:30. Now, if I would have kept it going, it would run every 2 minutes, no matter what happened to the repo itself. But now that I've selected poll SCM, okay, somebody says cannot hear you. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. So probably something wrong with that person. Okay, cool. So Nadeem says, why do you need to refresh the screen if you enable auto refresh? I don't really need to, Nadeem, but I did not want to wait for the auto refresh. That's why I did it manually. Cool. So we have 4:26, 4:28, 4:30. Now last build was run 1 minute and 54 seconds ago. So I'm hoping this poll SCM would run in 6 seconds. Now we'll wait for the page to be refreshed. Now you see there's a new build, right? Now if I look at the logs, it says cloning the repository locally. Now this should basically tell you that this job was actually run, and the Git repo that I provided it the I provided the URL of the Git repo. It actually cloned the repo locally. But obviously I did not say what to do with the repo. The only thing I said was, this is the repo and run the job every 2 minutes. So the point being, this job is run now at 4:32, but this job would never run again unless somebody makes a new commit to this repo. That's the only difference. That's how you hook up one of your Jenkins job to a repo. Now it might be a GitHub repo, it might be a Bitbucket repo, it might be a GitLab repo, whichever repo you have. The point is now this job would never run again unless somebody makes another commit to this code. This job will connect to my repo every 2 minutes, but just to check if there is a new commit. and it will only run if there is a new commit in that case. I hope the difference is clear about the time trigger and the poll SEM. Are we clear about that? Right. So I have a yes from Bala and Sandeep and Shripad. Can we please get a confirmation from at least a few more people so that I know we are clear? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you very much. So Sandeep says, and what if there is a new commit in the repo? So in that case, Sandeep, the job will be executed again. The only thing is, I'm not really saying what to do with the repo. The only thing I'm saying is, this is the repo. So it will simply clone the repo or pull the repo. But it won't really do much with the repo because I've not said what to do once you clone the repo. Right now, we're just looking at the triggers. We are not really looking at what happens once the job is run. Cool? Yeah. So Venkata says, can we clone only using pole SEM? No, Venkata. There is another option here. If I go to build triggers, there is another option here that says GitHub hook trigger. Now, I don't really want to get into this because this requires understanding of what a hook is in Git, not really Git, but what is a hook inside GitLab and GitHub.com. So you can look into hook yourself if you would want to, but this is not something that I'll be looking at right now because that's a bit advanced and that doesn't really give us any benefit at this point in time. At this point in time, as long as you know how to trigger a job automatically, you're good to go. Surya says, can we see the changes in the Jenkins as well like we see the changes in Git? I don't really understand the question, Surya. So obviously the changes, you can look at the logs and view the changes, cannot you, right? So it basically says it copied the repo, it ran the date command that I had, it ran the good day command that I had, and the job was success. Cool. So we'll move on at this point. Now we'll actually start talking about uh, the actual pipeline. And what do we mean by pipeline? What do we mean by, what exactly is Jenkins used for when it comes to proper application lifecycle management? Now, this is the code that I will be using. Now, here's a screenshot. This is what the application looks like. This is a very simple address book application that is written in Java. Now, this is all the application does. It can basically, it will, you can save your contacts, you can view your contacts, you can add a new contact, and everything that you would want to do with an address book. The point being, it does not really matter what application you're working with. The logic and the flow would always be the same. And there are a few things that you would need to understand by sitting down with the application development team. Now, this is what happened. This repo was shared with me about 8 months ago by someone at Edureka. And they told me that this is what I would want to use, to run the demo of pipeline in the trainings that I conduct. So my first question to them was, okay, assuming I've never worked on Java, my first question to them was, okay, it's a Java application. So how do you currently deploy this Java application? That was my very first question to the developers of Edureka. And they told me the first thing we do is we compile the application ourselves manually. Then once the application is compiled, we test the Java code manually to make sure there are no syntax errors, there are no coding errors and such. Once the test is done, what else did they say? Once we've tested the code, we review the code manually. And once the review is done, we package the code manually. And once the package is done, we deploy the packaged application into our production systems. So this is what they told me. So this is the important part. Again, creating the jobs, it's really easy. Creating the pipelines is really easy. But the difficult part is to understand how exactly this application works and what are the things you would need to do before you actually deploy the application in production. Now, trust me when I say this, I've spent more than 2 months just understanding the things that I need to do with a lot of companies. So when I start as a consultant with the companies, right, The first thing I do is I start looking at the application. I see how the application works. And the very first thing I do is I start Dockerizing the application. I start, Sanjay says, not able to hear you. Can we all hear me? Yeah, okay. I'm not sure why randomly somebody says they're not able to hear me for a moment. Anyway, so here's what it looks like. So whenever I start working with a company, right, the first thing I do is I usually end up spending more than a month just to figure out how the application is working, just to figure out how exactly is this application being deployed in the production right now. Now, that's the level of understanding that you need to actually come back to Jenkins and design a pipeline. Now, in this case, I know how this address book works. I know how to package this address book. I know how to compile this address book. In case I did not know that, like most of you would not know how this application works. Some of you might not ever have worked with Java. So you would have no idea how Java works, how this application works, how address book works. That's where you really have to sit down with the application development team and figure out how they're compiling it manually. Now, please understand the difference. I'm not saying you have to understand the coding part. I'm saying you have to understand the deployment part. How they are doing it right now is when you actually come back to Jenkins and start automating things. That's the very first thing that you have to do. So it doesn't matter if it's in this example, it's a Java application. If it's a Python application, the pipeline might look a little different because Python does not really require compilation. So you might just start with testing, reviewing, packaging, and deploying. In case of, let's say, C++ or a .NET application, those applications need to be compiled. So you would have the compile job. You might have some other tests that need to be run. So a couple of jobs may differ depending on the language or the application you're working with, but the flow, the logic flow in most cases would remain the same. So you do, the compilation, the testing, the review, the package, and the deployment part. Now, this is where the idea of CI/CD comes into the picture.